One of the most useful things when trying to put forward various concepts to bring about changes is to be able to really go to your own experience, in my case, my own experience, which is palpably changed from what it used to be. And so who I know myself as, which really means what is important to me in life. For example, attachment to outcomes might have been something that was how life was lived, and as that changed because it was seen to be part of the struggle, part of the uncomfortableness, part of the looking for something out there, as that changed, then feeling like outcomes were all important falls away. And so then we can say, well, I know myself differently because I see that the movement in each moment, what is being thought about, is different. And what is very useful in talking about the difference is to be able to go to the experience and say, okay, from a particular angle, if I want to talk about it from a particular angle, what is the best way to describe it? Which really means first it needs to be felt. It needs to be really looked at and interpreted correctly, let's say, or interpreted accurately, so that then the words that are used are most descriptive. And one of the topics is meaning. One of the topics that can be looked at, because sometimes it needs to really be thought about. I need to think about it. If someone says, what is the meaning of life? Then I need to go to my experience to answer that. To say, okay, what is the best answer for that based on how life is being lived or how I am being lived? And one of the things that becomes very palpable is to see that it's not so much that life becomes meaningful, but rather the sense that life is meaningless falls away. Or another way of putting it is that an experience of life that we could call life feels meaningful happens when suffering falls away. So what I mean by this is that when suffering is present, when the experience of life includes in it an uncomfortableness in the form of guilt and blame and pride, worry, expectation, any of the different forms of suffering, which is an uncomfortableness with oneself, by default, life can't seem meaningful when that energy is present, when that sense of self is present. What happens is life feels like it lacks meaning, or like we need to be getting somewhere, like we need to find a purpose. And it isn't so much that we need to find a purpose. That's what the feeling suggests. The feeling suggests, when I find a purpose, everything will be okay. My experience is that when I look at why life feels meaningful, it isn't because of something. It isn't because something has been gained. It's very clearly because a certain energetic sense of self has fallen away. And so contained within a particular sense of self is the lack of meaning, the feeling that something is missing, that there is a purpose, but I don't have it. And so then that creates this seeking outward, and we come up with conclusions because the feeling is very convincing. The feeling tells us this is what the answer is, when in fact it isn't the answer, but it's very hard for us to question it because it feels so real. So we come up with a conclusion, when I have a hobby or a pastime that I really enjoy, a hobby or a pastime that I can get stuck into that creates something, then everything will feel okay. If I can create a business that I'm good at and I'm successful at, and I can earn an income, then life will feel meaningful. Then I'll have a reason to wake up in the mornings. And if it isn't about creating something like a piece of art or a project or making a business successful, then we tend to think that it's about relationships, and in particular romantic relationships. And so we automatically, because there is this uncomfortableness, feel like something is missing, and that something is circumstantial. And the conclusion we have is that, when life finally allows me to feel passionate, to create, to produce something, then what's missing will be filled. And my point in talking about this is that when we really look into it and we see the change, the sense of meaningfulness comes not because we find something that we are good at, something that we can. So in my case, a lot of people might think, look, you spend your time talking to a group of people about a way of seeing life. The talks hopefully bring about change, and there's people that are grateful and appreciate that the talks are there. They explain how their life has changed. And so then the assumption is, of course you feel like life is meaningful because this is what you're doing. You've found your passion, and it's not that. So the point here is that the sense of meaningfulness doesn't come because we are doing something which is what our thought is. Often when we feel like something is missing, we have this idea, this belief. It's a mistaken belief. It's a misunderstanding, essentially. And I'm trying to point out in my long-winded way, but hopefully it makes the point. I'm trying to point out that it isn't about finding something out there in the future, but rather it's about this feeling of uncomfortableness falling away. And the feeling of uncomfortable essentially equates with a sense of meaninglessness, a sense of incompleteness, a sense of lack of fulfillment, a sense of lack of contentment. So once again, happiness or peace of mind, and when there is a sense of no purpose, a sense of boredom, a sense of lack of fulfillment with life, that is not peace of mind, that is an uncomfortableness. When when that's in place, then there isn't peace of mind. And I forgot what I was going to say. So. Another topic that I find interesting to bring forward is the idea that in order for this uncomfortableness, this energetic sense of self to fall away, life really needs to be described differently. Now, I describe life differently in that I talk about life unfolding as a happening, not our doing, that the movements that we consider my doing, the physical movements, the thinking, the emotions, the speaking, that we are convinced are something that I'm in control of, are actually happening automatically based on our design and how we respond, how we function given a particular circumstance. So that's quite a radically different description of life. However, in order for us to bump into a way of actually to bump into a dimension, what I sometimes refer to as a different gear in which life can be lived, life needs to be described differently again. And the other description that I'm talking about is what some of you may be familiar with as the descriptions that are put forward in, let's say, the top-down, the awareness-based teachings of non-duality. And in that description of life, the emphasis is taken away from daily living, is taken away from life as we know it, as a causal unfolding. So in the description that I mentioned, where I talk about life happening, that so many of the movements that we previously might have related to as things that I am absolutely, as an agent of everything that happens through me, in control of. When those things are described as happenings, one of the rationales that's put forward is that those things, including the thinking, the speaking, the movements of the body, are a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, that word or that terminology, genes and up-to-date conditioning, essentially just represents the physical structure. That's what the genes is essentially talking about, how our physical structure comes into existence at first in the form of a sort of a blueprint, and then that blueprint, that organism starts to grow and develop into what we are now. And that growth is never independent of the external environment that is delivering new conditioning moment after moment onto the growing organism. And so the external environment is one with the result in each moment. So, on day 2, hour 1, the organism is a certain way, and a minute later, and even a second later for that matter, it is a little bit different, or a lot different, and the environment is being part of that change. So what we are today is a result of 2 factors, and in this teaching it's 2 factors alone: our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the up-to-date conditioning essentially is the terminology that refers to how the new conditioning that comes in moment after moment after moment as a cumulative effect along with the genetic structure, what it has left. So the new conditioning moment after moment adds to our up-to-date conditioning. And then we find ourselves in a situation, we see something, we hear something, we taste something, touch something, smell something. And what it is that we see, hear, smell, taste, touch is not in our control. It's part of the external environment that we're not in control of. We don't have a choice whether to hear. If a bang happens, a loud noise, we don't choose whether we hear it or not. It's an automatic interaction of the sound with our hearing apparatus. And then that is processed by the brain, and a thought will arise. And none of these things are things that we stop and have choice over doing, but they happen automatically. And so that explanation implies in it cause and effect. So a noise that then travels through the air and is received by the eardrum, and that is sent to the brain and processed. It gets processed according to the structure of the brain and the person, and then a particular outcome according to that person's way of their structure, who they are. Someone might jump with fright. Someone else might turn around and be curious. And whatever it is that happens is unique to that person, to that situation, to that combination of things, and it's described as a happening, not my doing. But as you can see, it's still talking about bangs, loud noises, let's say a car backfiring, sound traveling through the air and being processed by the ears and then the brain, and creating the experience and the subsequent thinking, etc. Now, that definitely has the capacity to bring about change, but there are phases along the way, and at certain phases of the change process, different approaches are important. And the description of life that is different again from this causal explanation is very important and powerful. And what it tends to do is describe life as much more mystical than is likely to be the case when the descriptions are about causality and about practical daily living. Because the practical daily living, when we're talking about tables and chairs and bodies and genes and up-to-date conditioning, it's talking about the world that we know. And it seems sort of scientific, and it's less extreme an explanation of things. The non-causal explanation says life is not at all what it appears to be. That life as we know it is really just God. That everything is God, everything is happening because of God. Nothing is separate from God. That what we are is not separate from God. That anything that happens is happening according to God's will. That everything that is happening, the trees, the oceans, the sun, is not part of an objective world as it appears, as it seems, but rather a illusory appearance in the mind of God. Much like a dream that God is having. And God is dreaming the dream of humanity, the dream of this universe. And everything is as it is, exactly as it is, because God has become the manifestation as we know it. God has become this moment exactly as it is now. But even when we talk about God has become the manifestation, the more absolutist explanation is that the manifestation is nothing but an appearance, nothing but an illusion arising in awareness, made of awareness, witnessed by awareness, where there is nothing more than awareness. There is no physical object. There is no manifestation. There is no objective world. It is all simply, in principle, the same as a night dream, which is very convincing when it is experienced. It convinces us that there is a person in a world, that the objects are made of form and matter. And with the benefit of hindsight, when we can look at a dream from outside of the dream, we realize that all of those seemingly very real objects were nothing more than an imagination, an arising within a consciousness, where time and space had no independent objective reality. They came into existence with the creation, and in this case, the metaphor being used is the dream. And so the dream is the creation, the dream in which the dream character arises, in which the world that the dream character inhabits arises, and in that creation that has just spontaneously arisen when previously it existed not. Within that creation, the framework of time and space comes into existence also. And that when the dream comes to an end and the whole thing collapses, all the characters in the dream dissolve into nothing. The oceans, the objects that were there in the dream, the thoughts, all of the events that may have transpired moment after moment in the dream collapse, and the framework of time and space also collapses. And when we look at it like that, we see nothing of the dream was objectively or absolutely real or true. none of the content was absolutely real or true, including time and space, which are the basic framework which we assume is the actual framework in which all of life unfolds. And so the teachings, the esoteric, the top-down teachings that are wanting us to see life radically different, tell us not even time and space is real. It's a construct as part of the creation. So when I talk about the manifestation in this context, it would be talking about the apparent world of form that has come into existence as the creation in this moment. And so manifestation doesn't, in the context that I'm using it here today, doesn't actually mean that there is an objectively real manifestation, but rather the experience of one, the appearance of one. So there is the appearance of manifest objects, of manifest time and space. And so we can call that creation dreamlike when we look at it from a certain point of view, the manifestation, understanding that really it is an apparent or an illusory manifestation that fundamentally is nothing more than appearance in the mind of God. And God, what is God in this context? In this context, God will be described as awareness. That the very basic, the fundamental truth is awareness. That the world, the experience of the world, the experience of time and space, the experience of human beings within the time and space, and the unfolding of time, the unfolding of history, the unfolding of evolution, is all arising within awareness, is arising within consciousness, which is another word that can be used in different contexts, but in this context we can sometimes interchange the word awareness and consciousness. And it's often referring to what is fundamental, what is real. That without that, there would be no awareness of a manifestation, or no awareness of a momentary experience of life. Now, why this is radically different is because if we never hear about life described this way, and we just go to the experience of life as it's known, as the default, let's say, it's quite apparent from our own experience and how everyone else around us sort of behaves and what they confirm to us, that the experience is an experience of a world of form, a world of form that we would say is real, a world of form that we experience as being something that was here before I was here, and that will be here after I'm gone. Something that was here before God independent of God. I mean, when we just go to our experience and let go of any beliefs of religion or even spiritual beliefs, just the way life is experienced, we have no reason to think of God. It's not like the manifestation or our experience of life comes along with some watermark in the bottom corner of the screen that says, production of God. It appears to be something that just is, and the conventional wisdom that exists in society, except for religion, is science. And science says, well, this all happened because of physics. Now, I'm not, it's very easy to hear these talks, and just that statement might sound like I'm saying that's not true, or that is true. I'm not really saying any of this is true or not true. I'm just describing why teachings say what they say. Life needs to be described as radically different in order to bring about certain changes. I'm describing how they describe it as radically different, and why that is important. What sort of change does all of this bring about? Do I think it's important? Yes, I do. Even this perspective that I don't often focus on, yes, I do. I think it's important. Do I think that this perspective that I'm putting forward, where life is described as a arising in consciousness, is the absolute truth and that is the ultimate recognition? No, I don't think that that's the case. On the one hand, I would say that a more integrated appreciation of life, where life is lived as if it is a causal reality, an objective world of form, could be said from one angle to be more true, because that to me is how we end up living life. After various realizations, there is an integration, which really means integrating the understanding of the new way of seeing life, but then integrating that back into living as if, which doesn't mean it isn't really, but we'll pretend it is. It means living it as if, because that's really how we look at it, as if it's a life of form, time, cause and effect, with certain beliefs that were there previously having fallen away, and that's part of the integration. Beliefs that were acquired in the non-dual phase, and also the beliefs that were there prior to spiritual seeking kicking in. Now, if you'll notice I said from a certain perspective, the integrated understanding is more real than seeing life as a dream in the mind of God. But if that was the case, that's all that would be valid. It wouldn't be valid to talk about anything else. And so from another perspective, I see the need to see life this other way as equally necessary to bring about the change, or part of the change. So if we leave something out, then a whole part of the change process might be left out, and it's sort of like trying to I don't know, bake a cake without having, or bake bread without putting the yeast in. You can put all the other ingredients in, put it in the oven, and it just doesn't go anywhere. So you can't sort of leave something out. And that's why I think it's very important for us to understand, to appreciate that this movement is a movement that, from one perspective, there is no time and there is no process, and that's from the perspective I've been describing as the top-down esoteric explanations of life. And then from another perspective, how can we deny, which we tend to do when we believe the descriptions of no time too absolutely, which we also need to do in order for the changes to happen. But when we are going through that phase and we believe it too absolutely, then we ignore our own experience of life that shows us very clearly that even though insights happen instantaneously in a moment, in a particular moment, there's just a flash of insight. And that flash of insight seems to have nothing to do with the past and with time. And it very clearly seems to contain all the understanding in that moment. We know we didn't have it. When life is seen from another perspective, when we look at it, we say, well, we didn't have it 10 minutes before, or 3 months before, or 10 years ago. And we can see that our seeking is something that unfolds over time. And, as the years go on, we can look back and see, wow, this is how I've changed. And to deny that part of the experience, even if it's, to deny and to insist that there is no process, there is no time, in itself can become a dogma. Now, would I say that we shouldn't, or if we could, should we erase that dogma from happening? And I'd say no, we shouldn't. If we had control, if we could choose, would we choose to prevent that dogma of not accepting what our own experience shows us, which is that on some level time and process exist? No, I wouldn't, because the dogma gets set in place because we are absorbing the descriptions in such a way that we believe them so strongly that we are forced to see life radically differently. And that means to essentially push away our experience as we know it and describe it as ignorance, as mistaken, as illusory, as misunderstanding. And that's very important, to awaken to the other side of the coin that we've been completely oblivious to. And then in time, once that awakening has happened, we can slowly be brought back in by a teaching that says, really, are you quite sure that process, that causality doesn't exist? Is it not your ongoing experience that in order for you to make a cup of tea, you need to turn the kettle on? And from a certain perspective, we'll be so convinced that, yes, of course, but that's, like in a night dream. It appears like switching the kettle switch is what, allows electricity to go through the element, creating a movement in the molecules. And because the element is got an element of resistance. It then heats up and it heats the water. And then we get hot water for our tea. That's how it appears, but in fact, the hot water has nothing to do with the flicking of the switch. It's a bit like a cartoon that is created frame after frame after frame after frame, and each frame subsequently follows the next in such a way that it makes it look like each outcome is a result of a directly linked to a previous cause. But in fact, that's the illusion, because the the heavy weight squashing the roadrunner, which seems like it happened because I forget what the other guy is. Oh no, it's the roadrunner doesn't get hit by it's the coyote that does, and it seems like the weight lands on the coyote because the roadrunner, cut a rope that did that. But in fact, that frame is independent of the frame where the rope is getting cut. And so we'll continue to insist that causality doesn't exist, even though we wake up in the morning and with this view, what unfolds is still the flicking of the kettle switch. But life is being witnessed, let's say, from this spontaneous perspective, where the thinking that says this switch will lead to hot water, and any belief in that being a representation of truth, has been so severely interfered with that we can't accept the reality of that apparent causality. And that's that's good and bad. It's good in a way that it's happened, because it's created a shift. What's the shift? The shift is a shift of seeing everything that happens in each moment as immediately and spontaneously new, which really means that presence with what is, without labeling what is according to laws of causality and time and space, has been appreciated. There is a presence with what is that just allows a oneness between the perception and that which is perceived. And in fact, when I describe it as the perception and that which is perceived, there is an implication of separation. And so what is often described is that subject-object relationship, the perceiver, perception, and the object perceived, is collapsed down and is described as just perceiving. And even the word perceiving is sometimes set aside because it implies some causal operation, and it brings into the concept, the idea that there are eyes that are doing the seeing, and the eyes belong to the body, and so that is often dropped away. So the notion of perception and the senses are left out of the equation, and we're just talking about awareness. There is just awaring of what is from the perspective of formless awareness in which everything is arising. And the body has nothing to do with that awareness. And the awareness has nothing to do with the body. In fact, the body is just an appearance, a momentary appearance in all of the content. and that the content is ever changing and has no fundamental reality. Now, this this description of life implies a mystery, a mysticism about what life is that can be very useful, very helpful at undermining a lot of human suffering. In large part, what it implies is that everything is happening because it is created by an omniscient, all-knowing, cognizant force that is consciously creating everything exactly as it happens. And that what we are is not separate from that creative force. We can't be separate from that creative force because all there really is that creative force in which the whole appearance is arising. And that creative force is referred to and described as awareness. And self-realization is described as an awakening to one's true nature as the formless, the ever-present formless awareness, God, in which the whole universe arises, in which the whole universe as an appearance arises. So in this context, when it says the whole universe, it's not talking about a universe of form, but rather a universe of apparent appearance. And as seekers, if we hear these descriptions, what we are most dedicated to is self-realization, is awakening, is coming to know truth, coming to know ourselves. And so a teaching describes all that I've been putting forward as truth, as reality, as the absolute, as opposed to our standard way of knowing ourself, knowing life, as ignorance, as misunderstanding, as not absolute, not truth, not reality. So remember, enlightenment is often described as, sometimes I remember coming across a description that said, your true nature, which is realized in the enlightened state, reveals your brightness as being greater than the brightness of 1,000,000 suns. That's pretty impressive. So when we hear that, something says, that's what I want to know. Now that something is the something that is inherently not really satisfied with how we know ourselves, not really satisfied with life as it is. And so if we're told your true nature, that which is not being seen, that which is not known, is brighter than the light of 1,000,000 suns, then we go, yes, I knew there was a reason why I was here, to realize my true potential, to realize my essence, my nature. And so the quest for enlightenment begins, and so the openness, the receptivity to these descriptions as being the descriptions of enlightenment or of self-realization, of seeing truly, of truth, of knowing that which is, are welcomed, are surrendered. We sort of, if we come across a teaching that we resonate with, there is something that we could call faith that makes us believe, makes us be open to. Now, being open to is very powerful because it means change can happen. When someone is closed to what someone else is saying, change doesn't happen. It's, if you're trying to help someone and you can see where they might be getting something wrong, and you put forward the information, but you see that it's taken personally or they're not interested in hearing a different perspective, then you can see that they're closed and the information isn't received. There isn't any receptivity. And so it doesn't hit the mark. Whereas if we're open and we're willing to hear what is said as if, it's truth, that's when change happens. So you might be a little confused in what I'm saying, because I guess I'm oscillating in putting forward the teachings, putting forward the descriptions, and at the same time maybe implying that they're not absolute truth, that they get believed as absolute truth, and yet also saying that that's a positive, and then talking about how that has to change. And I don't apologize for any of that, because it's all sort of correctish in a relative sense. So this there's something in our system that changes radically, and one of the explanations of what changes is that our thinking is very identified with life from a perspective of separation, life from a perspective of many independent objects. And when the thinking relates to life that way, as objectively real objects, because of all of the senses that create a sense of separation, because the sense of touch, for example, is sensitive to differentiation of different objects and what they're made of. And so by touching different objects, there is a sensual differentiation which creates the notion, the experiential notion of separation. The sense of sight is aware of apparent boundaries between objects, and that can be seen because of the differentiation. And this can be said for all of the senses. So the senses, as they develop, automatically create an experience of a world of separate objects. And to further compound that, our communication modality is based on words, which are labels that allow us to communicate what we would like to communicate about the world of form, the world of separate objects. And as you know, a word is a separate word from another word that is a separate word, and each one is a description, a label of one of the objects out in the world. And language and the vocabulary of the thousands of words then all become part of our up-to-date conditioning, and our thinking is a thinking about the world of form that we know through the senses, which is a world of separation, and we then think in language, in words, which is more separation. And included in that thinking about an experience of the world, there is the sense experience of who we are as being a particular object in the world that has a special sense to it, that it has a sense of subjectivity, but the subjectivity is linked very directly to the object. And so this is a mix. It's like the perfect storm has happened that ingrains into the human being this interpretation of life that is adequately described as separation. And then furthermore, we know ourselves on the level of experience, on the level of circumstance, and circumstance is either pleasurable or painful on an experiential level. And we've added into the mix of how we know ourselves, how we think about life, how we experience life, based on the actual experiential feedback, we've added in the notion that pleasure is good and pain is bad. Pleasure is where my happiness is to be found, and pain is where my unhappiness is to be found. And a sense of self, which is part of the thinking. So humans have a psychological aspect to ourselves, which is very much part and parcel of how life is seen, how life is experienced. And so this sense of self becomes part of this landscape of separation, attached to outcomes, to the pleasure and pain of life. And so essentially this whole mix has caused or created a problem. It's created an entity that suffers in life. That's the current human condition. And it's become apparent that there is something beyond this. There is another way. Humans can be reconfigured in a way where a lot of these structures can fall away, and the experience of life, the experience of oneself, changes. Essentially, it's a change in the psychological identity, and the psychological identity is heavily influenced by the experience that we have of life, the experience that we have of ourself. And so the non-dual teachings, non-duality, not two, not many, non-duality. So duality means two, and two means many, one and another. Non-duality means there isn't two, there is just one. So I don't use the word non-duality that much, really, when talking about the spiritual teaching, because the focus ordinarily in most satsangs is talking about happiness for the human being in daily living, which I would describe as the integrated understanding of who we are, that leads to the end of suffering and peace of mind. And rather than talking about non-duality as the main realization, I tend to focus on the falling away of the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, which to some extent are follow-ons from this other shift that I'm talking about today. So I trust that the spiritual seeking process takes us where we need to go. So I know that a lot of the listeners, the seekers here, are also sort of got fingers in different pies, which makes sense. Which is, there's YouTube, and YouTube has all sorts of different goodies available. And so I don't expect that people just listen to one thing. There's days when you feel like you need some of this. And so I have no doubt that the exposure is there even if I'm not talking about it. So occasionally I'll talk about it so that we can see how it all fits in, how they all complement each other, how one thing leads to another. So this oneness view is very important, because so much of our suffering is based on interpreting life as a life of separation. And when we look at life as a life of separation, then all of the ground on which suffering arises continues to seem valid. And in order for this separation to fall away, the experiential separation, we need to start focusing on life as a momentary experience, not as an objective reality. If we see it as an objective reality, then the experience is going to keep feeding back that everything is separate, that all the objects are different and separate from each other. You can lift the lamp off the table and put it on the chair. You can pull fruit off the tree. And all of that sensual feedback keeps telling us that life is separate. So if we are pointed to the fundamental, that which is real, that's how it's described, awareness, consciousness, what it's trying to point out is that all of our senses are essentially just content in the present moment. And it happens to be fact that without awareness, none of the senses would be registered. And it does happen that if we do move attention to that which is unchanging, that which is primal, that which doesn't come and go, and so your experience of the bird or the dog barking is momentary, or it might last for some minutes, but a sound is always changing. It's never constantly there. And so when we start listening, the teachings know how to describe things such that what is important to be registered can get registered. And what's important to be registered in terms of seeing life as one, which becomes then the basis on which so much of our, the ground on which suffering arises then starts to dissolve, which means the suffering can no longer carry on as the way of relating to life, the way of responding to life. Because when that thinking arises and it's seen to be based on an idea of separation, once we've truly seen past separation as the fundamental truth and experienced life from a different perspective, then that thinking, which is based on separation, can potentially get cut off, because our thinking will throw up the thought that is not truth. That is based on seeing life the old way, believing in the illusion. And when a realization of another way happens, especially when it happens in a way that feels absolute, feels like we have gone past illusion and now seen reality, that is very powerful at cutting off certain thinking. What is described as the basis of life or truth, so life is described as an arising within awareness. And awareness is the awareness of God, not the awareness of the human being. So the awareness that is aware of the body, the awareness that is aware of the trees and the other people, is the primal awareness, awareness that is ever present even in deep sleep. An awareness that the whole universe is interdependent on, that without this awareness, the universe wouldn't exist. And when I'm talking about the universe, I'm really talking about the universe as it presents in our experience in each moment. And so that's described as the fundamental container in which life arises, and it's being described as the only truth, the only thing that is real, God. And so when there is an awakening to the awareness that is the background of each momentary experience, then it's automatically assumed to be as described. Oh, this is God. The awareness that we know ourselves as. This is the absolute. And there are aspects to it that are much more absolute than the relative, that which comes and goes, all the content is then essentially disidentified from. So the way the human has developed with the senses, there is an identification with form as truth, as absolutely real. And we can be pushed back to a point where we are encouraged to continually see life differently. That all of the form is relative, is changing, is not real. Focus not on the form, but rather on that which is aware of the form. Be that which is aware of the form. Know that that which is aware of the form can't be known through thought. It can only be known when thought subsides and there is a direct being that which is described. And the awareness that is described, or that is pointed at, has always been there whenever the experience of life has been there. And so it can be bumped into in any moment. And when it's bumped into, when it's realized, when it's seen, it's like, this has always been here. This has always been what has been, what is fundamental, what I am. So I'm talking as if this is truth. And I don't see it as truth. I see it as changes and realizations that can happen. And these descriptions are very important to be delivered this way in order for the realizations to happen. And then once the realization happens, because the descriptions have evolved, because from a certain perspective, the descriptions hold, and the descriptions come about because of a direct knowing that someone had of life from this perspective. And so how it's described is how they knew life in that moment. And so when that reveals itself, the description seems perfect. Of course, this is the absolute. I am the absolute. The absolute is that which is unchanging, and all the content is not separate from the absolute, being the awareness in which it all arises. And so it feels like we now know the absolute. But there's a refinement of that which will maybe at some point get us to realize that what has been pointed at as the truth, the reality, is the awareness, the consciousness aspect of the human being. That the human being has consciousness, and consciousness is where the experience of the world arises. Consciousness is where the experience of the human being, or the experience of the world contained within that experience of the world, is the experience of the human being experiencing the world. And so what is described as the universe arising in the mind of God may actually be the universe arising in the mind of the human being. A human being that we don't have an experience of, because we have the experience of the human being within the world that is arising within the consciousness of the human being, if that's what is actually happening. Why I say this is whether life is arising in the mind of God or in the mind of the human being is not actually that important. I would suggest that we come back to it being life arising in the mind of the human being, so that we can then live as if I am a human being in a world of time and space and objects. But only after the oneness of experience has happened, such that our obsession and our identification with form and separateness that allows us to know ourselves only one way, meaning not know ourselves connected, or not know the aspect of the human being, the consciousness, the awareness, which once that reveals itself, reveals itself as a home, a place where we can drop out of thinking, a place where we can start to feel like, even when things don't work out, if I abide at my center, at my core, the circumstance that hasn't worked out as I might have liked is not so important. Only because we have access to a dimension of the human being that is quiet, is content, is at peace. So without access to that part of ourself, we don't have that refuge, we don't have that home, we don't have that experience that says, if thinking stops, if it slows down, everything's okay, even when circumstance isn't turning out just as I would like. So there's no question of integration happening until a shift has happened, where we can find ourselves slowing down, stopping, and finding ourselves already at peace. At least temporarily finding that we can touch into this place that then allows us to, over time, remember that my involvement with outcomes in the future, worrying about the past, is all part of the suffering dynamic, part of the thinking mind. And as that's seen, if this space is available, because life is known differently, because a shift has happened that allows us to witness, to be aware of the experience of life as an experience from a perspective where we are not identified with form, not identified solely with the thoughts, with the emotions, with the body, but now able to rest in a formless essence of who we are. And so as that develops, then there's more capacity to see the thinking, the suffering, the thinking mind when it happens, and to drop out of it time and time again. And each time we drop out of it into the pure presence, which is really very simple. It's like, I hate you for what you did. Why did you do? And it's stop. The stop arises automatically because we understand that's suffering. That is identification with the body as something that needs life to turn out a particular way in order to be complete. And we can maybe come back and remember, I am already. I already am. And we buy out of the narrative that says, I will only be when that is rectified, when you say sorry, when life reverses itself such that you didn't act that way. And the more that we touch into this part of ourself that is quiet already, that is whole already, that is complete already, which is the place outside of the thinking mind, the more that what comes up is, who cares? Who cares about what they think? Who cares about what they did? That was a long time ago. Now I am. So I've spoken for just about the right amount of time. So we'll have a couple of questions. Hi, Eric. I'm having trouble hearing you, Eric. Are you muted, maybe?
Mike instead is better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. Yes, you finished in the right way, I think, for my question today, because I feel that that's finding that resting space you're talking about is that is sometimes available and sometimes not. And of course, it's when it's not available, the the uncomfortableness gets amplified, so to speak. But I am. My question was about the flip flopping, and it would be very helpful, I think, to maybe if you would like to talk a little bit about how that was for you, maybe, and maybe a few descriptions of possible handlings of the flops that that could be useful. And a part of this is maybe I can describe just shortly, because it feels a little bit like it's opening up and things are coming up, and it's usually when sitting silently, and it feels like it's opening. It's kind of physical, actually. Things loosens up in the stomach, and sometimes emotions comes up while sitting, and then it's just almost welcome. I mean, I can sit there and really feel the fear that comes up, or whatever it is. But sometimes it feels like it comes up later when in daily living. So I guess that might be the flop thing. Or what would you think about that? That maybe the opening up, which would be the flip, maybe, and then the things that come up kind of creates the flop. Or that I've been that's been my theory, at least.
Yeah, in brief, flip means where we find ourselves at ease with circumstance that at other times we know we wouldn't be at ease with, where we find ourselves at ease with emotions that come up because there's a space. Generally, that's what creates the sense of being in flow and at ease with things, where there isn't an identification and a resistance to what is happening, but a more spacious appreciation, awareness, witnessing of what is happening without us getting drawn into it. And when that spaciousness is there, what we know ourselves as is much less of the human, much less, we don't know ourselves so much as a human being, because there's a lot of the narrative that says, you know, this shouldn't have happened to me, and in thinking about the circumstance, there is obviously memory about the circumstance, and then we have our idea of who it happened to, and so a lot of that is absent. When that's present, then essentially there is an identification, because this knowing ourselves as the body and not connected to the spaciousness or the awareness. So that's really what the difference is when there is this capacity to just witness from a detached, uninvolved point of view, as opposed to the flop where there is an attached involvement. And there's a palpable difference in the experience. One, I would say, is very uncomfortable, and it forces us to resist, it forces us to try and fix, it forces us to blame and to find fault and to try and be right. And the other is much more allowing, where there isn't so much that feels like we need to do, rather that there is just an openness. But as you pointed out, it's not something that we consciously can control. It's really like two different apertures that happen. There is either an openness or there's a closedness. And which one is there is not so much in our control. It's a happening. And so that's the attitude that I suggest we have towards the flop, which is very hard to have this attitude, because this attitude of seeing it as a happening and not my doing, and that it's all part of destiny, is actually part of the open, allowing perspective. So for me to suggest that in the flop, the best thing is to have the attitude of seeing it as a happening, is, I guess it's an ideal, and it can happen. There can be a flop with this spaciousness to it to some extent. But if there's too much spaciousness, then it obviously stops being a flop. So what's frustrating is I could talk about in the flop, the best attitude to have is the attitude that this is a happening. But the reality is that in a real flop, the attitude is of resistance, of needing to do something about it. And that's the flop. So there isn't a suggestion really that I can give about how to deal with the flop, because the flop includes the way we deal with it, and it tends not to be the same way as when the flip is there. What can be useful to hear is that this flip-flopping and the flopping essentially means where we really feel like everything's gone out the window, like our understanding has reverted back. Why is it different to how it was last week when everything was so easy? That flop is very much part of the process. It's not that something has gone wrong. It's just an indication of the fact that the system was heavily one way, and now it's opening up, and it's a mix of the old way and the new way. And there's a struggle going on within the system where sometimes the old way is winning, that's the flop. And then at other times, the new perspective comes in, and that's when we find ourselves at ease. And for as long as the two energies are in the body, the two senses of self, let's say, one, the more true sense of self, and the other, the more believed, conditioned sense of self, then for as long as they're both in the body, this flip-flopping is going to happen. And over time, hopefully there is less flop. The flops get cut off quicker, and maybe are not as intense as they used to be. Although, having said that, there are going to be times when the process feels like it's very much coming to an end, and you can find yourself going into a very, very intense flop that seems very out of proportion with how the process has been happening. So there isn't, and even that is understandable. It's like, the process is going very deep, and now it's time to deal with something that is very concentrated, some energy of doership and attachment that is very concentrated. And so when that opens up, it can flood the system such that a very intense flop happens, which is usually not such a bad thing, because it means something is being dealt with, and afterwards, when that has been dealt with, then you'll probably find an even deeper peace.
On, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it's really helpful to hear all that you say, Roger. And the one main message there feels like it's whatever happens, it's it's happening as it should. Like that. It's very comforting to feel like even the flops are as a natural part of the process that as the flips, I guess, and it both terrifying and comforting to hear. I must say.
Yeah, I think it is important to hear it, because for whatever reason, when it happens, we tend to have a sense that it's not meant to happen, because it feels like a reverting back to the old way. It feels like everything that was understood has been lost. And unless it is described in a way, it's a bit like, having a sickness, and on day 5, on day 4, you feel much better. And then on day 5, there is a very high temperature and you feel really sick again. And if you know that illness unfolds in that way, where on day 5 you expect a very high temperature and to feel very sick, then when it happens, at least the doctor can look at it, and the doctor says, don't worry, this is all, it's happening as we expect. Whereas if you don't know, you might freak out and think, this isn't good. But it might be how it plays its course.
Yeah, ride through the storm when it appears.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Yeah, I'm very happy with that answer, Roger, and I'll leave space for the next question.
Very good. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say, firstly, I so appreciate the one-on-ones with you. They are so useful, and I feel they just help me get deeper into a space. And over the past week, just so much has just come off in terms of like identity and suffering. So firstly, thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for mentioning it.
And just quickly, I wanted to ask you about addiction, in terms of like, I know Nisargadatta used to smoke, but could you just quickly touch on that topic of like addiction?
So he had a Nisargadatta had a funny response to a question. Well, a Westerner wasn't so happy with what he was saying or how he was, and she criticized him, like saying, here you are meant to be an enlightened master, and you're sitting on tiger skin and smoking beedies, which are the Rolly cigarettes. And he said, firstly, I didn't kill the tiger, and secondly, I've been enjoying cigarettes for my whole life. I'm in my 70s. Why should I stop now? So that was his response to the question of smoking. The way he saw it is, it was pleasurable. He's not identified with himself as the body. from his teachings, not identified with himself as the body, not needing anything to change. And so if someone else has a problem with his smoking, that's on their side. What he's demonstrating is he has no question about smoking. However, and why did he keep smoking? It may well be that the body was physically addicted, and so there was a desire for it from a physical point of view, as opposed to a psychological addiction to the cigarettes. What very much exists, as well as physical addictions, are psychological addictions. And I think seeing the difference between the two is important. And if we have a psychological addiction, essentially I would describe it as being the body's way of dealing with an uncomfortableness. And as far as the body is concerned, that is the best that it has found to deal with the uncomfortableness, to fix the uncomfortableness. And what often is the case is that it is a body's way of gaining pleasure or distraction or numbing out. And the introduction of pleasure does something to the neurology that is essentially creates a sense of reward. And the sense of reward in the neural system basically says, I am good enough to have this reward. Life is delivering me pleasure, so I must be okay. Now, so those movements that the body goes to in order to cut off the suffering work to some extent. They provide a relief, but addiction tends to not be something that is dealing with the root problem. And furthermore, it tends to be something that has consequences, either social consequences, health consequences, or financial consequences. Under social, it could include problems with the relationships, problems with being able to work and look after yourself, etc. So if we find ourselves addicted to something, it's useful to see, am I going to that in order to alleviate a sense of uncomfortableness? And if we see a pattern that moves towards our preferred addiction in order to get some sort of relief from uncomfortableness, then we can look at what is the addiction delivering that provides the relief. Is it, and we could be addicted to arguing, where we want to be right and we might argue and feel like we're right in arguing. It could be an addiction to relationships where we play a certain strategy in order to get something from the other that makes us feel like we're worthy or something along those lines. And so if we get to see the structure, then especially if we have a context in which we're told that these addictions are essentially a form of making us feel temporarily better, but when we look at it, we're feeling temporarily better on the egoic doership side, where we are looking for something from outside to give us a sense of boost a sense of, oh, this is who I am. And as that dynamic is seen, then there's a chance for it to change, because we need to sort of understand that the addiction may actually be preventing us from looking at what is at the root and dealing with the real cause of the uncomfortableness.
Got muted. I muted myself. That's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, it's. I mean, you know me and what I'm, the identity that's playing out, and it's definitely the relationship, which is like the addiction and the kind of looking for that oxytocin release of like, love is the greatest, what is it, force in the universe or whatever. So I'm just looking at like the state of addiction. You know how someone would reach for cigarettes or reach for, chocolate. And but then I'm looking at the situation that's playing out for me and thinking like, okay, well, am I addicted to like love from the other, like, and that's, I'm seeing it with much more space around it now, but also clearly that there's this looking for the receiving of pleasure as well.
Well, I would say that attachment to love is the deepest of our attachments. And so what attachment really means is, in the system somewhere there is the deeply ingrained belief that my completeness will be found in that object, in that pleasure. And that's very important. The deeply ingrained belief in the system that says, not just says, that is deeply believed, that's where my completeness will be found. And so then we're forced to crave it. We're forced to move in that direction because it's deeply believed. And so as something comes in and says, what I really am is not dependent on love of the other. What I really am is already complete. Then that narrative, or not even narrative, but that introduction from the working mind starts to put a countermeasure into the system. And that hopefully means that deeply ingrained belief is being challenged. There's a sort of resistance force, what's it called when you've got a demonstration, like a political demonstration. Until a group stand up against something, then that force gets to run unabated. And so as our working mind starts coming in and reminding us, no, my completeness is not dependent on love from the other, that's this force coming in and resisting the old rule.
Yeah, I don't think without maybe I would have, but I don't think without the one-to-one sessions I would be so acutely aware of that. Like, it's only after that and really kind of figuring out what was at the root of suffering. And I'm sure everyone's, story is different. Like, what causes them the most suffering is different. And I think for me, it's that. And without seeing that clearly, and now I can see it coming up in the story of my unfolding of life so clearly, there's just this like massive gap between the outcomes of life and my completeness. And I, there's a lot of like, toing and throwing and all of that, but it's just like, I don't know, it's just like, I can breathe, it's so nice. So thank you.
Oh, this is good. Well, you're definitely not alone, because I think when we get down to the core of it, we're all sort of convinced that everything will be okay once there's love. And it just is at the root of our attachment.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I can now see that my completeness is here, like regardless of what happens, like if I break up with my boyfriend, or if, you know, my leg gets torn off in an accident, like touch wood. But, you know, I can see that my completeness is already here. Like outside of the story. It's like, wow. Yeah, it's wow. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for dropping in, Melissa.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye.
Hi, Simon.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Hi.
very well.
Yeah, okay. My question is regarding the satsang that you've been given today. There's a bit of confusion I've got with the psychological identity falling away and a oneness experience. I'm wondering, I know that you can have a oneness experience and the psychological identity can still be in place. But I'm wondering, how does the psychological identity falling away differ from when both the psychological identity falls away and a oneness experience happens simultaneously? And
sorry,
also,
just repeat that last thing, because it's important. Okay. How does the psychological...
How does the psychological identity falling away differ from when both the psychological identity fall away and a oneness experience occurs simultaneously?
Right, okay.
I don't know if I'm confused with that, so it might not even be a question, it might just be a confusion that I have. Also, which is related to this, is that you were going to answer a question in a previous satsang, which you got cut off and you didn't fully answer it, and I was really interested in the answer, which is related to this, is you were saying in how in a different and more subtle way the separating out can happen without the particular state created by an awakening.
Yes, okay. So just to reiterate the last part, often I talk about how this witnessing, this non-identification, or when the identification with form, the attachment, which I described in today's satsang as being a consequence of how we develop seeing everything as separate, knowing ourselves primarily as the body, not appreciating the awareness and the consciousness aspect because they're basically always there and they just become, taken for granted, not recognized. It's the gross objects that are where our attention goes. And so there is this identification with thoughts, identification with emotions, with feelings, and with outcomes. And very often, as was in today's satsang, the antidote to that is described as coming to know yourself as awareness, and coming to know, simultaneous to knowing yourself as awareness, knowing the oneness of life, the oneness of experience, or just the non-duality of life, let's say. And that's especially the case if someone finds themselves in the non-duality field, in the non-duality path. And so if we hear that the antidote to separation is oneness, and oneness is synonymous with knowing yourself as God, or knowing yourself as awareness, knowing yourself as that in which everything arises, and it's described as a shift, as very different, then it's no surprise that we become convinced that that is what needs to happen. And there are people in which, so the peace of mind, which is what I tend to make it all about, is overlooked in a sense, and what we tend to become obsessed with is the oneness, because the oneness is being described as the solution. Not only the solution that leads to peace of mind, because often it's not mentioned, peace of mind isn't mentioned, but just the realization, the oneness, the realization is what enlightenment is described as. So obviously we become very interested in this shift happening, in this oneness realization or this self-realization. And if we keep in mind that it's about peace of mind, and that oneness is really just part of the process that leads to peace of mind, and that there are other paths, essentially, that can still lead to peace of mind, because they do more or less the same things, but they do it in a way where how it's experienced is very different. And the best analogy I could use is that you can have someone that has a spontaneous oneness experience, often inspired by the teachings that they're immersed in, that tends to pop out of the blue and feel a bit like if you're on a big ship, the ship just being grabbed by a massive hand and spun around 180 degrees in the space of a second. And so if you were on the ship, you feel this very big contrast. It's an experience. It would be felt as something that you could put your finger on. It's like, wow, at such and such a time, the ship got lifted up, spun around 180 degrees, and we were looking this way one moment and that way the other. The alternative is that you're on the ship and the ship turns around 180 degrees very gradually over the course of 2 weeks, let's say. And the experience would be very different. The contrast between one moment to the next is not that great if it's taking 2 weeks to turn around. And after the 2 weeks, you're still in the same position as the people that were on the ship that got, flipped 180 degrees in half a second. Yet the path through which that happened was quite different, and the experience was quite different. And so if someone was on the ship that turned around gradually, they've actually turned around and they're pointing in the same direction. And yet if they hear all these descriptions about the people that were on the other ship that got lifted up and turned around in a second or half a second, and that is being described as what is needed, the people that were on the ship that turned around gradually might think, oh, I wonder when that's going to happen to us, and feel like, that hasn't happened to us. And it hasn't, but it has, if you know what I mean. So waiting for a oneness experience and a seeing life as a happening through a certain methodology, or not methodology, but expecting it to happen a certain way, may not be valid for some people because it may have already happened but a different way. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, but it's not that I'm looking for a oneness experience. I had a oneness experience long before I knew anything about non-duality or what a oneness experience was. And it lasted several hours, and it was everything. It was amazing. Everything was amazing about it. And it's not that I'm looking for that again, but there was something in that, a realization that occurred within that was basically that I realized that I'm always trying to get somewhere, and I realized at that time there is nowhere to go. What happens is the scenery changes, things come and go, but I never move. I always stay in the same place. And that was something that really stayed with me, is that there was nowhere to go, that this moment was enough. And I'm just wondering if the peace of mind that you're talking about here, is this available without the oneness experience?
Yes, I would say it is, because someone can have that realization in a much more subtle form than certain full-blown peak experiences. It can be realized, let's say, just by returning over and over to a space outside of thinking about the future. If certain beliefs have loosened up enough, then if you see yourself thinking about the future and realize how that is got an inherent uncomfortableness, has a inherent sense built into it or implication built into it that things aren't good enough now, and that maybe one day in the future they will be. And if that's realized and it's seen to be thought-based, and in that particular moment someone can drop out of the thinking and come back to, essentially we need to connect to our I amness, our existence in this moment, which is something that was what you mentioned was one of the revelations, is that what I am stays still. So you're referring to the ever-present awareness, which really is an aspect of the human being that is not part of the becoming, but part of the being part of the human being. And the awakening is not so much about how a connection to that being part happens, but rather that a connection to the being part, as opposed to the becoming notion of, our thinking. That's what's important, is for us to connect to the, I am. That's why I abide in I am is recommended, because what it reveals is that if we can feel it, not just think it, but if we can drop into a place when we realize, here I am, that here I already am. I don't need to become, I am. And it's not a thought, as you may well know. It's about a dropping out of thinking, and there's a great peace that happens as soon as the narrative that says things aren't right, I'm not comfortable, I will get there, but I need a whole lot of things to work out. That's when we're disconnected from our being, and it feels uncomfortable. And then we remember, I am, and we come back and connect. And so it really is available in any moment. And I don't think it requires a particular awakening. It just requires whatever allows us to realize that.
That's really good news. I was hoping this is what you'd say, because seems to be what's happening here now. That the intellectual understanding of the part of the seeking seems to be falling away, and it's like losing its energy. Mm-hmm. And what seems to be taking place is the I amness seems to be coming in more and more often, and taking away the thinking and just resting in the I amness, and it seems to be popping up more and more, and that's the way it seems to be going. So it seems to be like abiding I am is the way to go, and it seems to be taking the intellectual understanding of it all.
Yeah, and you see, for some seekers, this talk about abide in I am, what you've just described, isn't available, because that space outside of thinking just hasn't opened up. In the previous satsang to this, I was talking about how we can be pushing the door, trying to open it, and only at a certain point do we think to pull the door, and it just opens really easily. Whereas when we're pushing it, it doesn't budge, obviously, because we're putting all our efforts into open it. We've got the right intention, yet we're doing something minor in a way that is completely inhibitive to the door opening. And so there are a lot of seekers that haven't found their destiny delivering the benefit of having this capacity to drop into quietness. And so when that starts happening, it's very significant, because that's really where the true the true peace, the true change, or the true nature, or it's never going to be found on the intellectual level. So yeah, if we start really feeling and seeing that happen, then it's something we can be thankful for.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much for answering the question. It really cleared up the confusion there. There's so much common sense and practicality to this teaching, and in one respect it's so simple, the message, and on another level there's so much depth to it. So I'm really grateful. Thanks very much, Roger, for answering the question.
Thank you. I will just, you don't need to reply, but just quickly I'll answer your previous question. That is, you can have a oneness experience, and in the oneness experience, in that particular moment, all the thinking stops. And there is peace, but what is predominant is the actual qualitative change in the experience and who we know ourselves as, what we know ourselves as. And I would really say that a oneness experience is a peak experience. It isn't enlightenment. It is a peak experience in which maybe some things have been fundamentally changed in that moment. It can be an indication that some significant rewiring is happening. But I wouldn't say that is the rewiring of how things stay. And often, because there is peace that accompanies the oneness experience, we become convinced that it's about the oneness experience. And if we can open up to the idea, well, if you could have peace without a oneness experience, would you take that? And when we think about it, we might say, well, once you put it that way, if the peace is available, then it makes us really see, what is it? Are you attached to the oneness experience, or is it the peace that is valuable? And what tends to happen is that we don't necessarily think of them as available separately. We know peace when the oneness experience happens, so we assume that the peace is because of the oneness experience. And it's only when we start to see that there can be peace of mind without oneness that we start losing interest in the oneness experience. And when we haven't seen that, and the peace is seen to be synonymous with the oneness experience, then that's when we become very much attached to oneness. And so this is what happened in my experience, and I went to Ramesh and described it, and he said that was just an experience, don't worry about it. And he repeated that 3 times. And it was on one fine day after several months where I just couldn't grasp that what he was saying was valid, because to me that experience was very profound and there was peace. And it was only once I started to realize that the peace was being disturbed because I was craving it coming back. And then it clicked that the whole teaching is talking about peace of mind, that enlightenment is peace of mind. And I saw that the peace of mind was being disturbed by the craving for the oneness experience. And it was in that moment that I realized that if I stop craving for the oneness experience, I already have peace by and large, except for the disturbance of the peace because I want the oneness experience back. And that's when it clicked. This is all about peace of mind, not about oneness. Although, as I mentioned in today's satsang, oneness can be a very important piece of the puzzle for peace of mind setting in, but really because it leads to an access to this part of ourself, which is an access or a part of ourself that is outside of the identification with form and with objects. So if that can happen separately to a oneness experience, if it can happen separately to knowing life as a dream, so we don't need to know life as a dream. I don't think life actually is a dream. If we can find that access to the part of ourself, the being of ourself, whichever way, that's what's important. And that's important because it's a place where when the thinking mind is happening, when the suffering is happening, we can drop back to this being. Eventually, being becomes much less relevant because we wake up in the morning, we're living. We don't need to go back to being unless suffering arises. If suffering arises, it's important to have a place to rest, a place to drop out of the suffering. Each time we drop out of the suffering, it's weakening that habit. When the habit has been completely annihilated, then this being becomes less important because we don't need to keep going back there. So once again, we can see that it's all about process. And when we're in the process, so as you're experiencing at this point in time, you'd say the being is what seems to be most important. It's what seems to be most true. And it is because it is in that part of the process. And at some point, I would say it's not even about being. It's about peace of mind. And you might say, yeah, but being is peace of mind. Maybe being and peace of mind are arising simultaneously, and that there'll be a time in somewhere down the track where you can have peace of mind without even needing being. And so that's something for you to think about.
I mean, that's where the confusion was really, was that if you listen to your teachings and some of the top-down teachings at the same time, is they seem to just dwell on the oneness part, and for them it seems like a permanent state. I'm thinking of people like Lisa Cairns, who was one of your students, and it seems as though it's never left. It's the oneness experience, and I don't know whether that's why I asked if maybe it was somebody like that, where what's happened is they've had the oneness experience and the psychological identity falling away at the same time. So, and they're just sort of concentrating on the oneness aspect in their message.
Yes, I don't know that the oneness experience, it's always available to come back and recognize that life is an experience arising in awareness. When you drop back into being, that becomes known. So if it's always available, but, not necessarily at the forefront, but whenever you drop back into outside of the thinking mind, you can appreciate the oneness, even if it's it can be in a more subtle form than some of the full-blown peak experiences.
They do say that it calms down. When you first have the oneness experience, it can then calm down over time.
Yeah. And so it's always available. And I would just, I don't think that's what is, that's a consequence of the identification with outcomes, the identification with the form aspect of the human being, when that exclusive identification has fallen away and there is an appreciation of the consciousness and awareness aspect, then the oneness in a way is always there, but not in a way that I would choose to say that's what it's all about. I think there's so many different ways of pointing. They're all or there are so many different ways, and the many different ways are very valid. And particular teachings and teachers will look at what was most significant for them and what currently makes most sense to focus on, and that's what gets delivered.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Roger. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, it's 11:11 where I am, so that looks like a good time to bring it to a close. Thank you.